my kind of role in nature. I'm a hunter and a trapper, and I live off the land. Try to keep something between you and your target.
Tom Oar never asked to be famous. He didn't chase the cameras, and he never tried to sell a lifestyle. What he offered was something raw, something real on authenticity that couldn't be faked. For years, fans watched him navigate brutal Montana winters, tan hides with the patience of a monk, and live off the grid with his beloved wife Nancy, all without ever asking for applause. He wasn't just a mountain man, he was the soul of the series. But as the show's fame exploded and new faces emerged, something started to shift. And quietly, without drama, Tom began to take stock of those around him, not with anger, not with ego, but with a sense of profound disappointment. He watched as the lines between television and truth began to blur, and it bothered him deeply, because for Tom, mountain life was never supposed to be about ratings or recognition. It was about survival, about simplicity, about respect for the land and the people who came before you. And as he sat in the fading light of another cold Montana evening, he decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. Tom Oar is finally revealing the 5 cast members who pushed him to his breaking point, the 5 men who, in his eyes, betrayed what Mountain Men was meant to stand for. And what he has to say will change how you see the show forever. It started with someone he once admired, Eustace Conway. In the early days of Mountain Men, there was a sense of reverence between them. Tom appreciated Eustace's dedication to primitive living, his passion for Turtle Island Preserve, and his drive to teach others about the old ways. They were different men. Tom was quiet and methodical, Eustace was bold and intense, but they seemed to share the same values. At least that's what Tom believed. Over time, though, Eustace began to evolve in a way that Tom found hard to ignore. His once peaceful persona gave way to theatrics. He seemed more interested in proving a point than living by one. And it wasn't just posturing. There were legal battles, safety violations, and troubling incidents that piled up. Tom kept watching from afar, hoping things would settle down, but instead, Eustace seemed to lean into the chaos. When his preserve was shut down due to code violations instead of addressing the issues, he dug in his heels and fought everyone: inspectors, neighbors, even local government. That wasn't the mountain way Tom had grown up with. You didn't pick fights with the people trying to help. You didn't make enemies out of your community. And when Eustace's friend and partner, Preston Roberts, passed away, the show barely acknowledged it. Tom was stunned. How could a man who claimed to live by loyalty and brotherhood not fight for a proper tribute? That was the moment something inside Tom snapped. The man he thought he knew had disappeared, replaced by someone chasing a spotlight, cashing checks, and forgetting the very roots he once preached about. The respect faded quietly but completely, and in Tom's eyes, Eustace had gone from kindred spirit to cautionary tale. Then there was Rich Lewis, a man whose reputation as a mountain lion hunter preceded him. When Rich joined the show, Tom was intrigued. He respected the skills, the courage it took to track predators through the snowy mountains, and the years Rich had already spent living off the land. Both were Montana men, both were hardened by time and wilderness, and at first, Tom saw him as a true equal. But something didn't sit right. The more Tom watched Rich's episodes, the more scripted they seemed. Drama around his dogs being lost, hunts that ended in failure, storylines that didn't match up with how real hunting worked. Tom had spent his life surrounded by wilderness, and he knew that experienced houndsmen didn't constantly lose their dogs, not with the kind of tracking collars and GPS equipment Rich had. It started to feel performative, like the show was manufacturing tension that didn't exist. And worse, Rich seemed to go along with it. To Tom, that was unacceptable. Survival wasn't supposed to be a game. It wasn't about repeating dramatic plots or crying on cue. And then came the emotional exploitation, like the extended segments around Rich's dog Ruby. While Tom understood grief better than most, the way producers edited those scenes made it feel like they were milking the moment for sympathy. It felt cheap, it felt hollow, and most of all, it felt fake. Tom never said it out loud, but behind the scenes, his respect turned to confusion and then to frustration. Rich had the skills, the background, the real-life stories, but somewhere along the way, he started playing a part. And in Tom's world, once you start pretending, you've already lost the thread of truth. The third name on Tom's list was Jason Hawk, and this one hurt in a different way. Jason arrived on the show like a storm-tattooed, intense, and fiercely skilled in the art of blacksmithing. He brought a visual edge the show hadn't seen before. Fans were fascinated by his craftsmanship, his desert lifestyle, and his quiet strength. But Tom wasn't looking at the surface. He was looking deeper. Something about Jason's rapid rise on the show raised alarm bells for him. Tom had spent decades off-grid, slowly building a life of quiet resilience. Jason, on the other hand, seemed to appear out of nowhere with a background that shifted depending on which interview you read. Martial artist, chef, blacksmith, survivalist Jason's story felt more like a resume in the life. And that bothered Tom, because this wasn't supposed to be a stage. It wasn't supposed to be a performance. Jason's segments were beautifully shot, often inside a comfortable workshop with dramatic lighting and sleek edits. But where was the struggle? Where was the rawness? Tom had spent winters digging himself out of snow, nursing frostbitten hands, and rationing food. Jason's arc seemed too clean, too curated, like a man auditioning for survival rather than living it. And what really pushed Tom over the edge was the way the show began to frame Jason as an expert, teaching survival techniques, giving advice, receiving more screen time than veterans like Tom himself. Tom didn't resent the attention, he resented the shortcut. You had to earn your place in the mountains. You had to bleed for it. Watching someone fast-track their way to that status, no matter how talented, just didn't sit right. Then came Morgan Beasley, a wild card, if there ever was one. Morgan lived in the Alaskan bush, far removed from the rest of the cast, and brought a kind of untamed energy that some viewers loved and others found chaotic. Tom initially admired the grit it took to live that far out, especially with the isolation and brutal terrain Morgan faced. But it wasn't long before cracks appeared in that admiration. Morgan's methods were erratic. His plans seemed constantly in flux. He took risks that didn't make sense, not for the environment, not for the animals he raised, and certainly not for long-term survival. Tom began to see a pattern, one where Morgan seemed to value adventure over responsibility. Building a house in a place prone to flooding, raising livestock without secure shelter, undertaking dangerous flights in questionable weather. These weren't the calculated decisions of a seasoned mountain man, they were the reckless gambles of someone more in love with the idea of wilderness than the reality of it. Tom believed in sustainability, in patience, in earning the land's respect through discipline. Watching Morgan barrel through nature like it was a personal playground disturbed him. It wasn't just about survival, it was about stewardship. And Morgan, despite his ambition, didn't seem interested in that. For Tom, it wasn't enough to live in the wild. You had to live with the wild, and that's where Morgan fell short. Behind the impressive drone shots and rugged scenes, Tom saw a man trying to conquer the mountain, not coexist with it. And that made all the difference, but the one that truly shook Tom Oar, the one that made him question the show, the producers, and everything he'd poured into Mountain Men was Marty Mayorotto. Of all the cast members, Marty had the most mystique. He was a pilot, a trapper, and a man who operated in the remote Alaskan interior, seemingly cut off from civilization itself. He had that stoic presence, that quiet authority that made fans believe he was the real deal. And for a while, Tom believed it too. But then came the interviews, the off-camera revelations, the moments where Marty began to show disdain not just for the media, but for the show itself. He criticized the editing. He mocked the narrative arcs. He hinted that much of what aired didn't reflect the reality he lived. Tom listened, and at first he sympathized. After all, he too had felt manipulated by producers at times. But then Marty did something that Tom could never understand. He walked away. Not just from the show, but from the audience, from the legacy, from the chance to educate and inspire. He left with bitterness, implying that the entire endeavor had been beneath him, and that was a betrayal Tom couldn't stomach. Because even if the cameras twisted things, even if producers added drama, there was still something sacred about what mountain men tried to do. It introduced people to forgotten skills, to real lives lived far from convenience. It gave Tom a platform to teach. To honor the old ways, Marty could have done the same. But instead he chose silence, dismissal, disdain, and to Tom that wasn't just quitting. It was turning your back on something larger than yourself, on a way of life that deserved to be shared, however imperfectly. Now that Tom Oar has spoken, the silence surrounding these behind-the-scenes tensions is finally broken. He didn't name names with anger. He didn't call anyone out on camera. That's not his style. But through the years, through long conversations, with trusted friends, quiet reflections by the fire, and the look in his eyes whenever certain names were mentioned, it became clear. Not everyone on Mountain Men earned their title. Not everyone lived the values they claimed. Tom's disappointment doesn't come from ego. It comes from love. Love for the mountains, for the lifestyle, for the viewers who believed in what they were seeing. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all. That in a world increasingly driven by cameras and clicks, men like Tom Oar are becoming rare. He didn't need a script. He didn't need a spotlight. He just needed the wilderness, a sharp blade, and a bit of silence. And now, as he looks back on his time with the show and the people he shared it with, he's not bitter, he's just honest. And in the world of reality TV, that might be the most radical thing of all. Tom Oar, a man built from a quieter kind of strength, never sought confrontation, never needed to raise his voice to command respect. His presence alone said it all. So when he began to feel something was shifting within Mountain Men, it wasn't anger that stirred inside him. It was sorrow. A sorrow born of watching something once raw and real start to morph into something more polished, more packaged. In Jason Hawk, Tom didn't see a bad man or a pretender. He saw a reflection of the show's new direction. Jason was immensely skilled, no doubt about that. His blacksmithing was breathtaking and his grit was legitimate. But for Tom, the issue wasn't Jason's talent, it was what Jason's arrival represented. A show once defined by rough edges and real hardship now seemed to favor stylized shots of hammer sparks and cinematic desert sunsets. Jason was a symbol, not a scapegoat. He didn't do anything wrong, he was simply doing what he did best. But for Tom, who had lived through brutal winters, risked frostbite for food, and spent years without modern comfort, it all began to feel like a betrayal. Not by Jason personally, but by the show itself. Tom had sacrificed ease and recognition for the purity of a wild life, and now he was watching that life be distilled into something shiny and saleable. It hurt, because the wilderness wasn't supposed to be staged. It was supposed to be lived. Morgan Beasley, on the other hand, was a whole different storm. If Tom had quietly raised concerns about Jason, his feelings toward Morgan were laced with a deeper, more philosophical conflict. Morgan didn't just step into the wild, he tried to erase every trace of civilization in the process. With a degree in environmental science from the University of Idaho, Morgan had the academic credentials to understand the natural world better than most. But what he chose to do with that knowledge went far beyond rugged living. It became an obsession. He hiked over 275 miles on foot, across some of Alaska's most dangerous terrain just to reach a plot of land where he would build a home by hand, with no electricity, no roads, no internet, and for long stretches, no human contact. It was a kind of extreme self-reliance that impressed even the most hardened survivalists. But for Tom, it raised questions. Was this commitment to isolation noble or needlessly punishing? While Morgan gained attention for pushing himself to the brink, Tom couldn't help but ask, what exactly is the point of all this suffering? Tom had lived through enough real hardship to know that life in the wild didn't have to be a constant test of endurance. There was no shame in comfort if you earned it. And in Morgan's world, comfort seemed to be the enemy, what made things. Even more complicated was that Morgan wasn't just some thrill seeker with a camera. His background was legit cabinetry, fish processing, wrangling, horseback guiding. His resume was as solid as his resolve. But it was that same intense commitment to doing things the hard way that clashed with Tom's deeply rooted philosophy. Tom had spent decades building a life in Montana's unforgiving Yaak Valley, but he did so with balance, harvesting wood with care, maintaining harmony with nature, and fostering real community ties. He believed that wilderness life, while hard, should be sustainable. But Morgan? He seemed to wear hardship like a badge of honor. He didn't just live far from civilization, he ran from it. Tom began to see a pattern: dangerous river crossings, in inflatable rafts, battling high winds with barely secured roofs, chopping down trees for horse feed without a care for regrowth. These weren't just risky decisions. To Tom, they were signs of recklessness masked as resilience. There was a difference between surviving and daring nature to take you out. And every time Morgan flirted with that line, Tom grew more uneasy. He respected Morgan's bravery, yes, but not always his judgment. Even their views on community revealed how far apart they were. Tom, while off-grid, still leaned into the old ways of cooperation, neighbors helping neighbors, friendships formed around fires. Morgan, by contrast, built walls, not bridges. Isolation was his goal, not a byproduct. His lifestyle didn't just keep out the world, it rejected it. And that rejection extended even to the production crew. While Tom accepted a certain amount of producer influence, understanding that a bit of drama was the cost of doing reality, TV Morgan seemed to take things to the next level. He blurred the lines between showmanship and sincerity. Was he really crossing those rivers out of necessity or because the camera was rolling? Was the danger real, or was it being dialed up to make a point? Tom never accused him outright. He never had to. His silence said everything. There was a growing sense that Morgan wasn't just living off the grid, he was making a performance of suffering for the sake of the spotlight, and yet, irony never spared even the most committed. After all his rants against machines, roads, and modern help, Morgan eventually became a licensed bush pilot. The very man who once hiked hundreds of miles to avoid the system now took to the skies with an engine. It was a move that even Tom couldn't quite process. Had Morgan finally accepted that complete detachment from the world wasn't realistic, or had the demands of the show, or perhaps his own limits, finally caught up to him? When Morgan and his partner, Margaret Stern, quietly exited Mountain Men, after Season 8, there were no dramatic goodbyes, no fanfare, just a closing door on a divisive chapter. For Tom, their departure didn't come with celebration or scorn-only reflection. He acknowledged Morgan's authenticity. For all his extremism, Morgan did live what he preached. But Tom never stopped believing that survival should not be synonymous with suffering. Wilderness life to him was sacred, not a proving ground, but a way to live fully. And when that way of life starts to become about extremes, about isolation for the sake of storylines, about trading balance for bravado, that's when you lose the thread of what it means to truly live with the land, and so the unspoken divide between these two men became a symbol of the wider struggle within Mountain Men itself. Tom Oar saw the wilderness as a space for respect, self-reliance, and quiet dignity. Morgan Beasley saw it as a test to be passed each day with pain as proof of worth. Neither man was wrong. But they weren't walking the same path. One chose hardship as a byproduct of life. The other seemed to chase it. Tom didn't hate Morgan. There was no feud, no grudge, no harsh words. Only a deep recognition that not all mountain men are built the same, and not all philosophies can coexist under one roof, even one made of logs and steel. Their stories were written in the same wilderness, but their scripts? Entirely different languages.